Greetings, Mavericks and new viewers. Tonight, direct and live from the Maverick News Network World Studios. This is Maverick News with Rick Walker.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Maverick News Channel. We have a special broadcast set up for you tonight. Mike Pekarek of Ukraine Defense Support is going to pay us a return visit tonight. He is going to talk about what's going on in Ukraine. I think he's also going to react to last night's interview that we had with Mira Terada. I think he has a couple of things he'd like to rebut or offer an alternative perspective on. So we'll get into that with him. If we have time, we'll touch on the top news stories of the day, stories that will include plan to assassinate Donald Trump, some foreign national from Pakistan, apparently a plot foiled by authorities in the U.S., and also Kamala Harris picks her running mate. So we'll try to maybe get into that tonight, but our feature interview tonight is far more important than just that, so stay with me and we'll get into all of it when we come back on the other side of this.
He's a fighter. He's a survivor. President Trump, defiant, strong. He is determined to make America great again. Pay tribute to the 45th President of the United States with this collectible t-shirt from the Maverick News Memorable Moments collection. Even a would-be assassin's bullet could not stop him. Instead, he emerged with his fist in the air ready to fight for freedom. Get your Trump Fighting for Freedom t-shirt with any donation of $30 or more to Maverick News. There are two iconic artistic designs to choose from, but there is only one way to get these. Donate at freedomreporters.com. Support free speech, free media. Support Maverick News. Call 1-866-248-1490 or order online at supergeeks.tv.
Maverick News. The world is watching.
Okay, let's bring in our special guest for tonight, Mike Pekarek. Hello, Mike. Welcome back.
Hello, Rick. Thanks for having me back again. I sure do appreciate it.
My privilege. I really appreciate you taking the time. We have a lot of things to discuss tonight because there's so much going on with the situation in Ukraine.
Yes.
Where would you like to begin?
Well, we could start out. So I watched your interview with Ms. Terada, and I'd like to start out there if we could.
Sure.
And I'd like to lay out a little bit a prelude before going into how she's approaching the subject.
Okay, so let's just, in case people are watching tonight who didn't see the interview or maybe don't quite understand, Mira Terada is the person behind the Foundation to Battle Injustice, I believe is what it's called, in Russia. And she's also heading up the BRICS Journalists Association, also in Russia. Controversial figure, arrested on drug charges extradited to the United States, stood trial, convicted of money laundering in a plea deal. The drug charges were dropped after allegedly being caught with a kilogram of cocaine under the hood of a car, accused of being an accomplice in a drug operation with her, I don't know if still or former boyfriend or common law husband. That's pretty much it. Then served 30 months in prison in the United States, went back to Russia, and is now involved in online influencer activity, social media stuff, and part of a allegedly, according to Western media, she's heading up what they're describing as a propaganda operation that was set up by Yevgeny Prigozhin, who was the head of the Wagner Group, who was also the guy who was sort of spearheading what appeared to be possibly an attempted coup against Vladimir Putin. And he is now no longer with us, having been killed mysteriously in a plane crash. Is that about it in a nutshell?
It's pretty much what I've read. Sometimes these things are difficult to nail down because our ties to reliable sources in Russia can be sketchy sometimes. I did read that after Prigozhin's demise, that she was kind of taken under the wing of folks in the Kremlin and was enlisted to help them run their influence campaign, to put a nice name on it. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about is there are a lot of words and a lot of stories coming out of Russia concerning all sorts of things. But in specifically about Ukraine, I wanted to give some background before I go into, because I wanted to lay down what we know about the factual history of why is Ukraine fighting back, because that's one of the key messages that is coming out of Russia is, Ukraine is not a proper nation. Ukraine is, the people are not valid people. They're not separate. They're just Russians. There's all sorts of that kind of thing going on. But fight back Ukraine did, and they're still fighting back. They're in the third year of a war against the Russian army, which was supposed to be the second army in the world. So here we are. It's important to understand. I know Ukrainians. I've traveled through the nation a few times, and them fighting back was not a surprise to me. The vigor and the somebody's asking me to turn my volume up. The vigor with which they fight, and the dedication to the fight and the creativity that they're pouring into it is not anything that should be downgraded. It's just astonishing, the level of resistance that they're giving. And they built this up. Ukraine has been under Russian and Soviet rule for more than a century. The current Russian government, and this goes back into the Soviets, where it's kind of an oligarchy kind of a government where laws are kind of what the oligarchs say they are, kind of a thing. And lots of corruption. They like to keep nations like Belarus and Kyrgyzstan and all those kinds of things under their thumb. And Ukraine was having none of that. In 1990, when all of the Soviet Union was falling, Ukraine kind of jumped on it. They jumped on their own independence. They're like, yes, we want to be free, finally. One of the biggest Ukraine diasporas, the biggest number of Ukrainians both in Canada and the United States, actually came out in the early 90s, and they were like, we can't do this anymore. We have to leave. So the significant number, a couple of million Ukrainians left because they didn't trust that Russia wasn't going to come back. They didn't trust that it was going to get any better. They went through a whole bunch of stuff, and then after the wall fell, after the Soviet Union fell, there was the 1993 Russian Constitution crisis. So they weren't trusting Russia anymore after that, because if they can't even keep their own government going, it's kind of an issue. There was the 1992-93 war in Abkhazia. Then Ukraine says, well, Russia's willing to use force again, just like they did Prague 1968 and all of those Cold War times where they sent tanks into big cities to put down civilians. And so the Budapest Memorandum came out, the agreement in Budapest, backed by Russia, the Ukraine, Russia, the UK, and the United States. And it was supposed to guarantee Ukraine's independence. Then there was the First Chechen War. Ukraine decided that they wanted to move towards Europe. 2004, they actually did their first attempt that didn't quite succeed. But they did eventually manage to elect a president that wanted to move them more towards the West, more towards a system of capitalist kind of an economy. Rule of law was very important to them because rule of law will help get rid of their corruption problem that they inherited. And then 2014, they finally had their successful revolution. But Russia couldn't handle the idea of Ukraine calling their own shots. So in 2014, Russia invaded. There was all sorts of other things going on. There was a sidebar to that was just this spring in April, the Czech government declared it an act of, what did they call? Declared it a deliberate attack on Czech soil. This was the 2014 ammunition warehouse explosions. And I can't pronounce the name of this village, but I can type it in if you really want me to. But you can Google Czech Republic ammunition warehouse explosion 2014. It'll come right up. It'll be one of the first two pops. So these were the same two operatives that they filmed and they tracked inside of the Czech Republic because it was a delayed explosion. They actually had to do some Sherlock Holmes bit to just figure out how it even happened. But the same two Russian operatives that tried to do the nerve agent poisoning and assassination attempt in the United Kingdom were the same two operatives that blew up that Czech warehouse, the ammunition warehouse. Yes, that's the one. And these weapons were supposed to go into Ukraine in 2014. There's still a little bit of a mystery about what actually did the Russians target the wrong warehouse. There's still a little bit of a mystery going on here, but that was absolutely a Russian attack on Czech soil. And for the record, the Czech Republic is a NATO nation. So with that in mind, the Ukrainians, they know what Russian rule is like. They lived under it for a long time. They want nothing to do with it. And then when Russia decided they would attack, and then they said, no, we're not having it. So the only way, because we tried diplomacy for a couple of decades, diplomacy did not work. And if Russia, after those decades, is going to attack us and kill our people and destroy our cities, then we have no choice. We have to fight back because the only alternative is obliteration. We either fight back or we're gone. And so that's the fight Ukraine is in. That's the fight Ukraine understands. And that's where we are. Ukraine wants peace. They don't want this war. They never did. They never invaded Russia. They never attacked Russia. They don't want war. But war came to them. So they fight back. They had no choice. When somebody comes at you, you either have the choice of laying down and taking it or giving it back. And Ukraine chose to give back. So that's where we are right now. There's one thing that could end this war right now. Russia could pack up and go home. They could leave Ukraine, and Ukraine would say, yeah, we're done. Peace. I didn't want to say peace out, but I'm going to say peace out. And it's not just little things that Ukraine suffered. There was the Holodomor in the 30s that killed several million people, but that wasn't the only one. Under Brezhnev in the Soviet Union, there was another, what they called Russification, which is a very nice term for genocide, what the Soviet Union would do was they would move Russians into nations like Belarus and Estonia and Ukraine, for that matter, Poland and East Germany, Kyrgyzstan, all of the Soviet nations and the Warsaw Pact nations. They moved Russians in. Then they tried to implement a system of, well, the Ukrainians are there. We're going to make it harder for them to have jobs. We're going to give them worse healthcare opportunities, while the Russians that we moved in, they're going to be living like kings. So it was an attempt to erase the national cultures in those areas and replace it with Russian. And that happened under Brezhnev in the 60s and 70s. So that explains when the Soviet Union fell, all the Ukrainians that could, they were like, I got to go. And they ended up in places like Seattle and just all over America and Canada. So just as a background, what I heard from Miss Terada, it sounds like she has a formal role, but sometimes that can be difficult to tell. So I don't want to sound more certain than I actually am. But she was doing the Russian line. Russia has a tradition of what they call maskerovka, which translates pretty well, called masquerade, or any sort of deception kind of a thing, which you might say, well, okay, deception. That's just the way sometimes things go. And I get it, but maskerovka has its own specific definition, and it covers all sorts of things. And in this case, what it's covering is something, when you're talking about people in diplomacy and soft power or strategic influence jobs, would say is, they call it FUD, F-U-D-D. And that stands for fear, uncertainty, doubt, and despair. Yes, that would be maskerovka. And FUD, fear, uncertainty, doubt, and despair, the job and the idea is to cause chaos, erode trust in basic institutions, use sock puppets and mouthpieces to incite problems or even violence, or just cast doubt. You just throw things out there and somebody might believe and it might catch hold. Create a sense that there is no hope for the future. That's certainly what they're trying to do in Ukraine. They're like, why fight back? You're not a real nation. And I would like to point out that under the Geneva Conventions, some types of propaganda are fine, but certain types of propaganda are specifically illegal. And I'd like to read from the Geneva Convention of 1983, Article 20, and I will note and re-emphasize that Russia signed the Geneva Conventions of 1983. So under Russian law, this is illegal.
If I could just pause for a moment. Like Deborah, and I'm getting this from people, whatever happened to talking about things in Canada, this affects Canada. We're involved. We're sending aid to Ukraine. We have a vested interest in Ukraine. We have the largest diaspora Ukrainian population in the world in Western Canada. This affects us. This is a Canadian issue in every respect. So I appreciate the comment, Deborah, but this is why we're talking about it. It's a Canadian issue. It's definitely a U.S. issue. It's a NATO issue. It's a global issue. And it's an issue that could affect the entire world, because all of these conflicts are bringing us a step closer to a possible kinetic third world war that might even potentially go nuclear. So I'll just stop there and throw it back to you, Mike. Sorry to interrupt.
No, it's great, because we understand. I explained why the Ukrainians were fighting, but not necessarily why the Western nations, the free nations of the world, need to support Ukraine. And one of the reasons is Ukraine wants to be like us. They don't want to be oligarchy ruled. They don't want their corruption anymore. They don't want what they had for 100 years under Russian rule. They want to be like Canada. So they, in many ways, exhibit the best of us. Sometimes I like to say that a lot of the grit and determination that Ukrainians are showing is what I like to think the best of America is. I'm American. And the grit that Canada has shown in the last century. And it's important to support people that want that. Because if we walk away, what you're willing to walk away from is what you're willing to say is okay. And if you're willing to walk away from a war of aggression, an unprovoked invasion, thousands of war crimes, if you're willing to just say, hey, that's great, you do you, I'll do me, what you're saying is that war crimes are okay and that we shouldn't get involved, and it's okay. It's not. You can't walk away from that. I did want to read that propaganda for war and any advocacy of national, racial, or religious hatred that constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence shall be prohibited by law. So when you hear RT or the Kremlin or anybody talking about these points, say that Ukraine's not a nation, they don't deserve to be independent, and just all of these dehumanizing propaganda points that they are putting out, that is actually a war crime. And one of the things that Ms. Terada put out there, she was, journalists who are not aligned with the government of Ukraine are persecuted, and they're on a list. Basically, they've been identified by a group who exists to investigate and document and report war crimes. And so there are Russians on this list. She calls them journalists, but what I just said about the Geneva Conventions of 1983, they have committed propaganda war crimes. And so among all of the other things, that's why they're on the list. But one of the techniques that they use is when they're accused of something, they being the Russians, when they're accused of something, they turn it around and say, well, you're doing it too. So it's one of those logical fallacies of, even if somebody else is doing it, that doesn't mean that what you're doing is right. But in this case, it's this thing, well, you're doing it too, and it's not, the accusation is not correct, the Russian accusation towards the West. So this is part of that FUD with uncertainty, doubt, fear, uncertainty, doubt, and despair, where they're consciously trying to sow doubt, these accusations against Russia. Well, everybody else is doing it, and these people accusing me, in addition to this name that I can't pronounce, I am so sorry. I'm going to try. Maratveritz, I'd like to say.
Maratveritz.
Yes. And
website,
they also accuse the Clooney Foundation for Justice. Amal Clooney, George Clooney's wife, is a very accomplished international law specific. That's her specialty in law. She's a lawyer that specializes in international law. The Clooney Foundation for Justice exists for the same reason as the other group, is to investigate, document, and report on war crimes. And since they're investigating and documenting and reporting on Russian war crimes, that means Russians are going to go after them. In the same way, they're going to start saying, well, you're calling for journalists to be assassinated. Well, in February of 2022, the Russian government passed a law that all Russian journalists must, when reporting on Ukraine, use the official Russian government line. They cannot report on anything else. If it was not approved by the Kremlin, they can't say it. So that means they are not journalists. If they report on Ukraine and they spread the Kremlin line, they're no longer journalists. They are mouthpieces of the Russian government. So they're not journalists at this point. They might still be. They might be on other subjects, but on Ukraine they are not. So it's sometimes fine distinctions of law where the truth requires context and requires knowledge, and it requires a little bit of attention to detail, where a lie, you can just spout it and somebody's like, yeah, that kind of sort of makes sense. Or they'll use words like, these journalists are being targeted. They're not. And this is the reason why they're on that list.
So, okay, so here's this website, Marotrovitz.
Yep.
I've talked about it here on this program. I even put a petition together because I'm opposed to any targeting of journalists, period, regardless of where it comes from, if they're legitimate journalists. So this has been described by a number of people, especially pro-Russian journalists, as a hit list. And they're saying that some of the people on the list, which includes journalists, artists, some political activists, some of the people on the list have been assassinated or killed. It's your position that this site is not that. What can you explain? Just explain how you view this.
So if you go on that site, which you are,
Yeah.
there are more things than that list. So for instance, they will document other war crimes. But yes, they do have a list, and it's a little bit, I would not call it a hit list, but they do, okay, these are the propagandists. And so it's a little bit of a, I'm trying to figure out the right word. So if you are trying to get legit news and you're trying to find a journalist with integrity that is going to give you an honest shake, even if it's wrong, they're at least going to be trying to do their job. Then one of the bits of information that is useful is that, are there individuals out there who are trying to pose as journalists, and they're trying to pretend that they're giving you news, and they are not doing that. That, for me anyway, is valuable information. Now, it is actually possible, because anything's, at some level, some things are possible. It's that these sources will, excuse me, sorry, it's been a long day here.
Okay.
That these sources will give you useful information, maybe not the information they intended. So, for instance, I watch RT. I read Russian sources. TASS, back in the day, I'll go back and read just sometimes for historical interest. I'll read some of the old Soviet outlets that were out there back in the 80s and the 70s and earlier, just to see how are they framing it. What kind of ideas are they trying to put out there? Now, this is entirely separate from whether it's propaganda or anything like that, because to me, even if it is propaganda and wrong, I think knowing it or knowing what they're trying to say is actually valuable information. So I highly dispute that Marotrovitz, I'm getting better, is a hit list. I highly dispute that. It is a list of people that group has documented as spreading Russian propaganda. Now, in terms of war crimes, propaganda is not something that's a huge crime, but it can be important. So if you think back into World War II, where you're talking about the Holocaust, and there are a whole categories of people, not just Jewish people, but also gypsies. In Europe, they call them Roma, or Romer, depending on where you're at. Basically, roaming, they don't have they don't have homes, they roam around. So political dissidents, homosexuals, that's where the pink triangle comes from. A lot of people don't know that, but the pink triangle, instead of the yellow Star of David, when you were in a concentration camp for being a homosexual, you wore a pink triangle. And that's today, when you talk about LGBT groups wearing that pink triangle, that's where it comes from. They decided they would own it and turn it into something that it wasn't. So, but the propaganda at the time, you think about Goebbels, who was the head propagandist. who were talking about a whole category of people that everyone was evil. They weren't individuals. The entire group was evil. That's the kind of propaganda that is considered a war crime. So maybe some of those people on that list, maybe we should revisit. I'm not going to say that every single person on that list maybe deserves to be there, but that group is at least trying to be accurate. Now, if you did challenge a specific one on that list, then maybe they'd take it down. Now, as for some of those people being dead, you can Google some of them, and this isn't great, but it is true. When you go to the front lines, it's not safe. And that sounds like it shouldn't be said, but sometimes when people talk about, well, this war correspondent died, and that's a bad thing. Well, okay, but I agree with you. But if you're going to the front lines and you are within artillery range and sometimes within rifle range or certainly sniper range, and things go sideways, you're going to get hurt, and some of them aren't going to come back. And that's one of the choices a combat journalist makes. In the U.S. military, we have something called combat camera. And if you think about some of those very famous pictures, Canadians had a whole bunch of troops on D-Day, Normandy, June 1944. And some of those amazing pictures, how did those pictures happen? That's because a combat journalist was there. And all sorts of danger. They put themselves in harm's way to take pictures, to document it. It's important work, but it is very, 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 very dangerous. So did some of them die on the front lines? Yes. Were they deliberately targeted? No. But if you're near Russian troops, the Russian troops are a valid target. There's going to be incoming, and mistakes happen, or it's not a mistake necessarily because the troops were a valid target, whether the journalist was there or not. So I'd feel bad, but that's not a crime.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I may need to revisit that whole website issue, get more information on it, and I'm open to revising my views on it.
I would say though that this goes back to something I said last time I was on. If there is a crime and Maverick is wrong, that's important information. So if somebody comes up with real information, I couldn't. It looked like a legit site. They report on other war crimes. That site exists for a lot more than that list. They covered Bucha and Izium for as an example. If that list is wrong, if there's people on that list that don't deserve to be there, that is valid. Nobody's above reproach. Nobody gets 100% of everything right. So if there is something on that site that's not right, by all means, that is worth somebody's time.
Fair enough. Okay. Let's pivot back to the center of the road here, I guess, and get back on track with what we sort of started with a while back, which is the interview with
Yes.
Mira from yesterday, right?
So yeah, she actually directly, because I was going into her attacks on Western journalists. One of the things that she said was European and Western media are restricted. There are no independent media allowed, and the public is a media vacuum, which is a little bit weird because I, as a pro-Ukraine person, are on your show, and you're a Western media journalist, and you had Mr. Terada on yesterday, and we're presenting opposing viewpoints, and that seems pretty free to me. So just the fact of her and I on the same show within hours, you said it was last night, and it's that kind of puts the lie to her claim. And there's all sorts of other Western outlets that do that. The existence of Tucker Carlson, for instance, who's free to say what he says. I don't agree with it. I think it's flat wrong on the facts, but just because I disagree with him doesn't mean that he doesn't have the right to say it. We can go after him because you can say something in America. The freedom to say something does not mean that you are free from criticism for what you just said. So if you say something and somebody comes back at you, well, that's part of free speech as well. So, but the Western environment still seems very vibrant to me. And I did mention earlier that she says this and talks about Western media, but like I said, in February of 22, the Russian government passed the law that basically said that the Russian media is not free. If you're reporting on Ukraine, you can't even use the word war. It has to still be, what do they call it? Special military operation? It's
Yes.
Does anyone know the term euphemism? That's a term that needs to come back in fashion, where you're using fancy language to make something really horrible sound actually kind of, nice or at least harmless. And a special military operation sounds like you could be, like in America, you could be sending the National Guard down into Florida after this hurricane to help people out. That's a special military operation. But in Russia, you can't call it a war. You can't call it an invasion. That is actually illegal. You can go to jail for saying those things. So when you're talking about free speech and free journalism, you might want to look in the mirror there, Ms. Terada. As far as I can tell, we haven't censored anti-Ukrainian, pro-Russian voices. As far as I can tell, I might be wrong. Maybe some of those have been restricted, but in America, I can still get to RT. I can still get to Russian Telegram channels. I can still go on Russian government websites. Near as I can tell, there's no Russian sources that are currently blocked.
I can say that in Canada, RT has been taken off cable systems. But you can
well,
still
I don't have cable.
Yeah, well, you can still access the stuff online. So
sure. So I will say that the cable, that's a Western company, and RT can broadcast everything they want. That doesn't mean that cable company is required to rebroadcast it. That the cable company has rights as well. So the cable company taking RT off of the cable is not an example of government censorship. It's an example of a company saying, we want nothing to do with this. They're free to do that. I have more stuff. We don't necessarily need to talk about it. So the reason that Russia changed their laws, the official reason is they wanted to limit foreign influence in the country. That's kind of the road that they're going down. One of the things I wanted to touch on that she said was, I believe she couldn't name the source. I couldn't find the source. And from what I could tell from what she said, it was a private conversation she claimed she had with a Western journalist, but she couldn't name the group. I think it went from Financial Times, maybe it was Forbes. I think she ended up on Bloomberg, maybe, but it cycled through a couple of sources. So I couldn't find it. I'm not sure. It was a public conversation, but she claims this person stated that the White House approves articles as a way to discredit U.S. freedom of speech and our news, and makes the Western news propaganda. If I remember what she said, and I kind of now wish I had typed it out more specifically, is that it was involving a prisoner transfer situation sometime in the last couple of years. And there's been a couple, like Brittany Griner, the one that just happened with the two Gershkovits from the Wall Street Journal. Trying to remember the former Marine. I can't remember his name off the top of my head. But she was saying that this, and she kind of buried this, and it the more that she talked and the more she hedged, the less serious the claim sounded. And so she started out with saying, the White House is censoring these journalists. But it ended up with her saying something like the journalist had gotten in contact with the White House press room and asked for commentary or if something was correct. And the White House said that they weren't going to comment or they weren't going to give any sanction to what he wrote. But that's just how journalism in the West works. So if you've got a story and you want to run with it, and for instance, if you're talking about a prisoner transfer involving the White House, you're going to maybe cover your bases and try and do your job and contact the White House and say, do you have any comment on this news story I'm about to run? The White House might or might not comment on it. And then you have the choice. Can you run the news story without the White House comment, or do you hold back until you have more information? Both of those are valid journalistic choices, depending on what the news story is. If it's really hot, maybe you just run with it, and fair enough, especially if you sourced it well somewhere else. But you see where I'm saying is that she's using this FUD thing, the distract and the doubt and all this kind of stuff. And she started out with this really, really strong statement that the White House is censoring the journalism. And then she hedged and she walked back, and then it wasn't a public thing. And then it wasn't actually a news article. And then it was a private conversation. And then it wasn't really even a thing. So it starts out with this big claim, and that might get the headlines, but there's nothing there. There's no there, as I can't remember who said that. And again, go back. Russia is ranked 164th out of 180 nations by the World Press Freedom Index. So, places like North Korea are worse than Russia. That's the company they're keeping. The United States is actually not as high as I wanted it to be. I didn't write that down. I'd like to say that the United States was actually around 50, which actually surprised me. I kind of wonder how that came up. Canada might be higher. But then I also have not seen the statistical breakdown. So if anyone has studied statistics, I actually think that's one of the most valuable classes I ever took. And they should be teaching statistics to anybody with a high school degree, should at least have a basic understanding. So if on this distribution for press freedom, if you've got near the top, if you've got 70 nations and they're all really close and they're all in this really dense pack right up near the top, well, yeah, you have to rank them. But everybody in that top group is going to be right up near the top. And then there's going to be a break, and as they go down and down and down. So I haven't seen this statistical breakdown. I am kind of curious why the United States ranks lower than I thought they should. So that's something that, when I was researching what she said and I found out Russia was 164th, well, that raised more questions. So I have more research to do.
Well, I will say that, I've experienced censorship here. It's not necessarily like some of it's coming from government, because it has ramped up since around 2016, which I've never seen censorship like we're experiencing now before. It's different now. So there is more censorship here in Canada. I think also in the U.S. But I've also pointed out to people that I can sit here and I've been in front of this microphone and I've said, Justin Trudeau is the worst prime minister in Canadian history, and I don't go to jail. Yeah. So, it's...
And if you've got a reason to say that, it's like, fair enough. I don't know your reasons for saying that, because I don't have a strong opinion on your prime minister. But if you're free to say that, I am kind of curious what you mean by censorship, if you're interested in pursuing that a little bit further. Like I said, I want more research, so now I'm curious.
The Canadian government has passed recent legislation aimed at controlling information. They're having a hard time dealing with online misinformation, disinformation, even propaganda. So the government is responding, I think, inappropriately and in a misguided way by invoking more censorship, directly and indirectly through legislation. It's having a chilling effect on journalism. You're also getting these large media platforms, like social media platforms like Google, Facebook, they're imposing their own form of censorship, which isn't necessarily directly connected to government, but indirectly it sort of is, because during the pandemic, for instance, they're enforcing certain kinds of narratives, preventing people from saying certain kinds of things. I understand what they're trying to achieve, but they're taking a sledgehammer to drive in a nail, right? So in my view,
Sure.
this is I think they're having a hard time dealing with the new realities of this new technology,
Sure.
internet, social media, and even artificial intelligence now.
Sure. Well, and the artificial intelligence can actually be kind of scary if you put out something that looks like somebody and it looks like an official statement. That can cause kind of serious damage there.
And just to elaborate a little bit more on that, see, in Canada as well, we have this Online Streaming Act now, which is trying to deal with the business and economic, financial implications or problems created by social media, because it has gutted legacy media. The revenue streams have been disrupted. So they're now trying to force social media companies to pay, like Google and Facebook, to pay news organizations for their content. And this has created a situation where Facebook now has banned in Canada all news content. They won't carry it so that they don't have to pay. That's the unintended consequence of some of this
Sure.
new legislation, which is a form of censorship as well. And that's actually impacted what we do here too. So anyway, I'll throw it back to you.
Well, and I know that this is already a while ago, but when the print journalism, every city's newspaper, that kind of stuff, started losing the revenue stream in the late '90s and the early 2000s, and then there was kind of cultural angst in the United States anyway about you had all these wonderful newsrooms like the Boston Globe and everywhere. Seattle Times was a good one. The Denver Post was a good one. The LA Times, the Houston Chronicle. I'd like to say Dallas Morning News, but I can't quite remember if that's right. Atlanta Journal-Constitution. And all of these, this kind of idea that is so central to American values. It appears in our very First Amendment. And the print journalists that were no longer able to afford the extensive newsroom that they had of experienced, smart, capable, hardworking journalists was consternation. That was cause for consternation in the United States. I didn't necessarily pay attention to what it might have done in Canada, and I'm a little sorry for that. It wouldn't surprise me if it was the same sort of a thing, though.
Yeah, well, we've seen too in the U.S., right? We've had those hearings where it was revealed through the Twitter files that the government was influencing content and censorship on Twitter, X. So there has been government influence directed towards social media platforms.
Yeah, from what I understood, that was more of a request than a demand, at least in the United States. But yeah, I mean, there's questions. The other thing to think about is if we go back to the existential crisis that we're talking about in Ukraine and the idea that this is a 1938 moment, that kind of a thing. What levels of propaganda constitute a war crime? Going back to Mr. Terada, when you're in that massive of a conflict or that massive of a world danger situation, governments start censoring. If you read about World War II and what could be said and what couldn't be said, even to, they're not going to go after you, but like the posters, loose lips sink ships. And I say that now I'm thinking about early World War II when America finally joined in, but it took us something like 9 months to shut off our city lights at night because the U-boats were sinking our ships because they were backlit by like New York City's skyline, and the U-boats could just see our cargo ships and they would sink them. And it just the struggle just to get people to shut some lights off so that the war effort could go with fewer ships sunk. But I do get what you're saying, and you have to walk a rope because even during wartime, at least in the West, like I said about the combat journalists at Normandy and all through World War II, and it's been a thing ever since, if I remember correctly, the first Crimean War for Ukraine, the first Crimean War in the 1850s was the first war to be photographed, and the American Civil War was the first war to be extensively photographed. There's tens of thousands of photographs in the National Archives from the Civil War. It's important to document accurately what happened. It's important to have security. It's important to do what you can that you have to do to win the war, but at the same time, it's also important to have an accurate accounting of it for any number of reasons, for history's sake, but also for now. If there's a problem and the journalist is the one that's going to be finding it, you kind of still need that journalist out there doing their job. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right. It's complicated. I think if there have been oversteps, I don't know that subject as well as maybe I should, but maybe there was. Maybe we need to rethink it and revisit it. And like I said, if there's a problem, then let's by all means look at it.
Well, there are always problems. We're never getting it perfect, and it always needs to be, freedom needs to be protected.
Yes.
And that means that we need to try to limit censorship. But I understand why the government's doing what they're doing. I don't agree with their solution.
Sure.
Is
yeah.
where I'm at with it at the moment. But we'll keep refining this over time. Mm-hmm. And I think there's an old saying that says, where in Canada, or maybe even with regard to democracies in general, we keep getting it wrong until we finally get it right.
Yeah. So. Well, and that's an American phrase. We keep talking about making a more perfect union. That's even going back to our Constitution. But in our Constitution, when the preamble, in order to make a more perfect union, I'd like to say it was Article 5, which details the process for changing the Constitution, so that when you come up later and you need an amendment, there's a part laid out, because back then they knew we weren't going to get it perfect. They knew we were going to struggle. They knew we were going to have to change things. I do want to say we can go back to something that Ms. Terada said, because she was talking about her own arrest, but she had a very gross, and I mean that literally, and that's gross and disgusting, interpretation of the American 13th Amendment. Because she was talking about, I was mistreated and we were slaves and all that kind of stuff. That's not what the 13th Amendment says. So the 13th Amendment outlawed slavery, but you had to be careful on how you framed that. Because if you just say that Americans cannot be held in a state of bondage against their will, then all of a sudden your criminal justice system can't function. Because what you just said, if all you say is that Americans cannot be held in bondage against their will, you just made illegal locking somebody up into prison. You can't imprison a murderer. You can't imprison a drug dealer or a money launderer. So what it specifically says is that involuntary servitude is only allowed if convicted by a crime. And then we have also the other things about you have to go through due process. The accused has rights. She was complaining about everything you say, everything she said could be held against her. Well, yeah, that's a Supreme Court ruling in Miranda. That's what the Miranda rights are, that the police have to say, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. That's American law. So, yeah, you have the right to remain silent, but if you say something, there you go. So you can't be forced to say it, but if you do speak, that's part of the official proceedings now. So her interpretation of American Constitution and American, because this actually protects people. You are not allowed to be held in slavery. you
So
have to be.
this is the part of the interview where she was talking about how she had been psychologically abused.
Yeah.
Is that what you're talking about? So she spends 30 months in jail. She says that she said in the interview that she was held in solitary confinement the entire time and was never, over those 30 months, ever allowed to go outside. I know that there are laws against that in the United States, so I don't know how that could have happened unless some laws were broken. I have to say, I found it hard to believe. Maybe give her the benefit of the doubt, but 30 months in solitary confinement, never being allowed to go outside. That's what she said. And then I think you have a clip here that you had set up talking about mental rape. Did you want to run that?
You can if you want. It'd be interesting to have her actual words on here.
Yeah, I can add that if you'd like.
Sure.
I can run this. Here we go.
Of what you're thinking, especially because when someone is controlling your the way of your thinking, not letting you think freely, and it's again going back to propaganda and stuff like this. This is already a true mental rape, something more serious, than we actually can imagine on a physical level. Because that's already dealing with the consciousness, subconsciousness, superconsciousness, and so on. So it's a very serious violation on a completely different level.
Well, as a journalist, I'm all about making sure that people can think with accurate information. So what she was saying there is, I said, what define or tell me exactly what you mean by psychologically abused, and she came back and said that they had been gaslighting her in prison, whatever that means. And then she elaborated with that statement. So that's really and mental rape was the phrase that she used, which sounds pretty serious.
And then she was also, so I'm going to go from really serious, but like she did before, where she made a really bold claim, but then what she said after that and the support that she has for that doesn't stand up. That bold claim that I specifically mentioned earlier was talking about the White House censorship, which, as she went on and on, she did not back up that statement. So one of the things that she said was something about controlling your thinking, but last I heard, mind control was not a thing outside of science fiction. So I don't know how that came up. Gaslighting is a term, and let's see. Just so that I don't get it wrong.
Do you want to define that?
Yeah. So
that's
what
like
Psychology Today...
Yeah,
Psychology Today says it's an insidious form of manipulation and psychological control. Victims of gaslighting are deliberately and systematically fed false information that leads them to question what they know to be true, often about themselves. They may end up doubting their memory, their perception, and even their sanity. So she's making a pretty bold claim here.
She maybe saw the Alfred Hitchcock movie, Gaslight.
Yeah. So, there was an old late night PBS thing when I was growing up called Gaslight Theater, where they would show, I don't know, like British movies or something. I grew up in Denver. So I have questions. Again, going back, if there was actually a problem there, we should investigate it because nobody does it perfect. American prisons are sometimes not the best places in the world. But the same time, she was arrested with a kilogram of cocaine, and she had been under surveillance for a while as part of a money laundering scheme that she was running out of a travel agent shop in Houston, which is kind of good cover when you think of it. Random people are coming into your shop and all that kind of stuff, and you talk about different places and all that. So I have questions. She also started walking it back later outside of that clip that you played where she was talking about, she started walking it back. So it was COVID time and they had to keep people separated. One of the questions that she stated that I want an answer to that, if true, is valid. She said that they couldn't go outside because of COVID, which when I was in Germany, that was not a thing. Most of COVID, I was living in Germany as I was an active duty U.S. military member in Europe. And outside was one of the places you could go, because the thing about sunlight is a great disinfectant is very true. Harsh UV light kills viruses, and I don't care if you're COVID or anything else. Harsh UV light kills viruses. So if you're outside, I went running and hiking and to keep myself moving and not inside my house all the time. If the prison systems had set something up where they couldn't go outside during COVID, I have questions. If it was something else, because she mentioned something about solitary, American prisons don't hand out solitary confinement for nothing. So I have questions about what she did. So I have questions. And given what she said elsewhere and the complications of she'll make the bold claim and then not back it up, I have questions. I think if there is one serious thing, though, that the not being able to go outside is one of the things. Like, really, somebody made that call? And maybe they made the call in good faith, trying to protect people because you could isolate them better inside. I don't think that was the right call.
Now, I will say that MK Ultra mind control is actually a thing, and they did actually conduct experiments at a hospital in Montreal. There was just a recent court case involving the families of victims because they wanted to sue the U.S. government, but because the CIA and the U.S. government had been doing it in Canada, there was a limit on how much there were limitations on jurisdiction. So the families have not been allowed in Canada to sue. But I will say this as well. If Mira had been subjected to the kind of experimentation that really did go on in that hospital in Montreal, right up until the late 1970s, I believe, she would probably be a vegetable today, because they were they were doing all kinds of crazy things to people with LSD and shock therapy, and they were literally taking people who were lucid and turning them into, they were destroying their brains, essentially. So horrific stuff. Separate story, but if that's where if that's what this is, what the allegations are about, that it was some sort of an MK Ultra mind control thing. Absolutely not, or she would not have been sitting there talking to me the way that she was speaking to me.
Well, and that's one of my questions. What proof does she have? Is she making a bold claim without any sort of backup because that's her job with the FUD thing, the fear, uncertainty, and all that? Because she can make "I was tortured." That's kind of like nobody wants to be tortured. That's kind of a thing. So, but then she walked it back. So this is kind of on par for what they're doing. Cause, if you look at the prisoner exchanges in Ukraine, where Russian soldiers, are exchanged for Ukrainian soldiers, Ukraine, it's one of these things where Ukrainians actually get mad until you explain this to them, that Russian prisoners are given, cigarettes and clothing and all that kind of stuff, because that's what Geneva says. And I'm 100% sure that the United States says, if you start mistreating prisoners, we have a problem. And then the Ukrainian prisoners are coming back and their skin and bones, evidence of torture, scarring. Then this is another thing where Russia's being accused of something, so she's trying to throw it back. But when you look at her arrest and legal record, she was arrested with 1 kilogram of cocaine. She had been under surveillance. There was a money laundering, drug mafia thing going on. She got let off pretty light. If that was what was going on. She was young. She was a first-time offender. They dropped the drug charges. They only pressed the money laundering charges. She only served 30 months. That's a pretty light sentence. She was talking about some other things with her lawyers, which I'm sure the the government was trying to get her to flip a little bit, and maybe her lawyer was saying, well, this is a plea agreement that was offered. And in the United States, the ethics that lawyers have to live by is if the person that they represent is offered that kind of a deal, that kind of a plea deal, they are ethically required to inform the person they represent about that deal. So she was talking about what her lawyer had been pushing. He'd been under control of the U.S. government and all that kind of stuff. And I'm like, no, I'm pretty sure you're describing how the legal system works, because, again, this is in place to protect the accused. If you've got a lawyer that is not ethical, and they are your defense lawyer is trying to ensure that you get the maximum sentence by not telling you about some of the plea bargains or the lessened sentences or any of that, and they're trying to make sure that you are in the worst possible case, well, that's kind of a problem. So these rules where the lawyer is required to tell her things like this, they're in place for very good reasons, and it protects the accused. So her flipping the script on this is just kind of par for the course. And I if there's something there, then yeah, let's look at it, but I'm not seeing it. And the way that she started to describe after her bold claim, and then she starts going into the details, I'm not seeing it at all.
And just so that people don't think that I'm some whack job conspiracy theorist, here's a CBC article on the MK Ultra mind
I didn't
control
say it.
thing. I know, but it's easy for if I were to tell my parents this, they would go, "Oh yeah, there he goes again, crazy son of ours." But CBC, CTV, many media outlets, we've covered this story here. We had a family, a member on part of the class action lawsuit.
Well, and I think one of the things that came out of all that was that mind control didn't actually work. Does that make sense? They messed people up, and it didn't actually work.
Yeah, they didn't really have the success that they thought they were going to have. They basically destroyed people's minds, destroyed people's lives. That's why you have the lawsuits.
Yep.
That are still pending. They're still trying. So
and that happened in the United States too. And I will point out that the fact that these sorts of things get investigated, there was some things in the United States. There was the Tuskegee experiments pop immediately into mind. And I'm trying to remember some of the other ones. I don't know if you're aware of the Tuskegee ones, but that's where I'd like to say black men were injected with syphilis without being told. And it no good. But one of the marks of a free society is that comes out. That gets out. And speaking of journalists break that story. It gets investigated. The people that did it, it comes out, and it becomes part of our real narrative.
Just like that.
Yeah.
Just like this. And while it's still working its way through the courts, eventually I think somehow, some way, justice will be served. But it will take time.
So...
anyway, we should move on.
Sure.
I'm getting off into the weeds there a little bit, just because I'm trying to protect my own reputation.
So, you're not Mulder in X-Files. Yeah.
This is not Infowars.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Good show. Sorry, I need to revisit X-Files now that I'm thinking about it. So one of the things. We should maybe go back to, we skipped a couple of things. One of the weirder claims that she made, I had to scroll back up in my notes here because we went down to her prison stuff, is Ukraine has been committing drug trafficking, organ trafficking, and NATO weapons trafficking, and that's being used by the cartels. So that was a really weird claim to me. It is true that after 100 years under Russian control, Ukraine had an oligarch system. There was rife corruption, like there is in Russia right now. And they've been trying to fix that. That's the 2004 election, the Maidan revolution in 2014. That's what they're trying to fix. The truth is there's no evidence of organ trafficking that we can find. I couldn't find any. outside of claims made by Russia. So I did find a lot of claims made by Russia. In 2022, the Canadian Foreign Intelligence Agency issued a statement that said Russia had been falsely claiming that Ukrainians are harvesting and trafficking organs from soldiers and children. That had been investigated and been found to be false. Now,
this is one of these other clips you have here, where she's talking about the White Angels and the Phoenix group, and there's some brigade as well that I don't remember if it was.
We can jump to because children are in this. If you want to do the White Angels one, sure.
Sure. So I'll run this clip that you have here, and you can comment. Use this to sort of underpin what you're about to talk about.
Back, and our witnesses told us that within those people, they recognized some of those people who came with the aid, but this time they were wearing the military uniform, and
take the children.
They already knew where to go, what children they were looking for. Like they had an order, to get blonde children with blue eyes, age 8 to 11, for example, and they would go to their houses or places where they hide and pick up those children with the force, or even without parents being home or next to the children. In some cases, they would point the shotgun in the parents and take the children. That's the girl told us.
Isn't the White Angels supposed to be some sort of aren't they supposed to, like, they're portrayed in the media as trying to help people, at least in the Ukrainian media?
That's how they position themselves, and but that's not what the reality is like, because this is what media says, but we try to speak to people who live in those towns, who actually met them, and they know how it happens. They do approach by saying, we will take your child to the safer place. And some people some families let their children go, and then they cannot find them any longer. Some of them, they don't allow their children go, and White Angels, for example, tell them you can come with them, and halfway on the way somewhere, they would they will stop the car and tell parents leave, and even force them to go. And in some cases, they just, grab children and take them.
So the allegation is the Ukrainian military has, I guess, what do you call it? Like groups or some military people who go around and kidnap children so they can be trafficked, so they can be sold, so that they can be experimented on and their organs harvested and sold.
So again, she's got a real bold claim going on here. And if you've seen a pattern, she makes a real bold claim. And doesn't necessarily have the backup for it. So the White Angels, and there was another group that she mentioned, which
Phoenix, I think is what the Phoenix group was, yeah.
I looked up White Angels, and it turns out I knew one of the people that was doing that. They're still going around trying to deliver water and things like that, but with the front line a little bit more static than it was in the early part of the war. Then the previous need is not as high. The real sinister thing about what she's doing here, there's two things. The first one I'm going to go at is that there's a group, several groups of Ukrainians and other people, just as far as I know, it's just the Ukrainian groups, but there might have been some volunteers doing it as well. I don't know. That are going into a war-torn spot and trying to get innocent people out of the line of fire. She's attacking people doing one of the most noble things that you can possibly imagine. We talked about combat journalists going into the line of fire to document things and all that. Mm-hmm. These people are putting themselves in harm's way to go save people. They're on par with combat medics, things like that. And I will point out that these people wearing uniforms, if they're associated with the Ukrainian army, this is an example of Ukraine abiding by the rules of war. under the Fourth Geneva Convention of 1949, Articles 22, I've mistyped. It's 22, 24, and 132. The nations involved have a legal obligation to either protect citizens in harm's way or evacuate them. And that is, so these groups doing this is an example of Ukraine doing the right thing. On the flip side of this, it is a war crime to abduct children and put them back in. We have not only Western sources documenting this, we have Russian sources bragging about it. Russia currently has at least 20,000 Ukrainian children in Russia. They have been documented, among other places, by Maverick, that they are documenting Ukrainian children showing up on Russian adoption websites. And one of the, I forgot which article, I'd like to say it was 132 of that Fourth Geneva Convention, requires the warring parties to, if at all possible and as soon as humanly possible, reunite children with their parents. And Russia abducting 20,000, shipping them back to Russia and putting them on adoption websites is not doing that. I have real hard questions for Ms. Terada. Where did I write that down?
Well, in fact, I don't know if you were going to, that's what these ICC arrest warrants, International Court arrest warrants, are for Vladimir Putin.
Yes.
That's what it's all based on. It's the allegations that Russia has been taking children from Ukraine and taking them to Russia. And in fact, Putin hasn't denied that that's happening. They're just saying that they're taking the children to keep them safe, taking these orphans to keep them safe. On the Ukrainian side, if I understand correctly, Mike, the assertion is that these children are being taken and then sort of re-educated.
Yes. And that's, Russia is actually bragging about that. I'll find you a link. Unfortunately, I don't have it tonight. But part of the Geneva Conventions, this is one of the most insidious part of their propaganda push, is that you can use a half-truth to obscure the horror, to obscure the crime. So yes, it is Geneva Conventions. You are required to keep these children safe. You're required to feed them and provide them decent housing, all that kind of stuff. But that completely ignores the part of the law that clearly states you must reunite these children with their families at the earliest possible convenience. And Ukraine's been saying, look, we want our children back. We'll arrange it. We can do a swap if you want. We want our children back, and we have their families here. We've got them identified. And Russia's not doing it. So it's truly, it's a big deal.
It is, if these allegations are true, it is a form of cultural genocide. Canada is very familiar with that because of residential schools and Indigenous populations, where the government took the children forcibly from families, put them into residential schools away from their families to re-educate them and to educate the Indian out of the Indian.
And it's that same idea.
Yeah. So I totally understand it. I get why the ICC would level these charges. And if true, that is actually a war crime in itself. I'm in Canada, so I can say that and not suffer.
Well, and so the fact that Ukraine has offered to negotiate for this, for the return of their children, they have offered safe passage for the return of the children. If Russia really actually wanted to comply with international law and the laws of war, they would be negotiating this with, rather than holding the children back and putting them on adoption websites. So I do have a question. I don't know the specifics of Ms. Terada's story because she brought it up and I'm like, wait, what's going on here? She had something about a goddaughter or an adopted daughter out of Donbass that was 5 years old in 2014 and has been moved to Russia. And I don't know how many 5-year-olds you've ever met, but my daughter was 5 years old when we left Texas and moved to Germany. And when we came back from Germany, she had almost no memories of the United States. 5 years old, there's very few memories that are even formed. So she's having this person that this child, because if they were 5 years old in 2014, I guess that makes them 15-ish now. They're still a child, but they're being held in Russia. They were in Donbass, and she was talking about Donbass as in when Ukraine had invaded Donbass, but Donbass is, and according to international law, it's still part of Ukraine under Russian occupation. So I have questions whether she herself is involved with a kidnapped child. Where is that child's family? So I have questions. I don't know the story, so I might be wrong, just to put it, but I do have questions because she brought it up and I'm like, that's a really weird angle to go. What's going on here? And I started doing the math. I'm like, yeah, that might be an issue for you.
Well, here she is. I just went to Twitter to just see what she's been posting. She's on some other, she's got this on somebody's channel. And I think this is her talking about those white angels again and child abductions, as she might describe them.
Вернулись в военизированное образование белые ангелы. Среди этих людей узнали
let me just read this. Paramilitary formations appeared under the name White Angels. Among these people we recognize those who had previously distributed humanitarian aid.
Среди этих людей узнали некоторых из тех, кто привозил гуманитарную помощь, только на этот раз они были одеты.
Only this time they were dressed in military uniform. They had maps with the children's locations marked.
В военную форму. На картах нанесена разметка о месте нахождения детей, и они целенаправленно.
They purposefully went there and took the children away.
Чтобы забрать девочек,
they were specifically looking for blonde, blue-eyed girls 11 to 13 years old.
Это зачем?
What was this for? Well, of course, we understand that this is a specific order for specific children with specific goals.
Конечно же, мы понимаем, что это определенный заказ на определенных детей с конкретно определенными целями.
And this is Ukraine human rights abuses. You Black Soul. Who is this? Fearless John. Whoever that is. I don't know. So, I just brought it up randomly.
Again, that's a real bold claim. And like I said, one of the sinister parts of this, and she even was like, these are the humanitarian workers. And she's accusing, like she did with the Clooney Foundation, like she did with this group, the Maverick, and it goes on and on and on, accusing others of the crimes that Russia is committing. Now, if there's merit, then sure, investigate, but this looks like a bold claim that is not backed up. I couldn't find anything on the White Angels that was remotely negative. I searched hard and hard because, like I said, this is a bold claim. And if it's true, then we kind of have a real problem. But I couldn't find anything. All I could find were these groups doing their job and trying to help the civilians in harm's way.
Let me bring this up. I hadn't really looked at this before. I'm just bringing up.
I will ask, I do have one more question. So
yeah, sure.
She's got all these things going on that these are war crimes, and she talks about Ukraine invading in Donbass. And so she's kind of flipping the script here. If Russia had not invaded the Donbass in 2014 and the rest of Donbass, Luhansk, and Crimea in 2014, and then Kherson and all sorts of other places in 2022, would there have been this sort of chaotic environment going on? Because war does cause chaos. It causes problems. The White Angels wouldn't have existed if Russia hadn't invaded and there weren't civilians and children in harm's way. So her flipping the script on this, on people trying to do a good job, we kind of have a problem here. She can't even legally call it a war. She can't admit that Russia invaded. She talks about Donbass not being part of Ukraine, this sort of propaganda of going after the national integrity of Ukraine. There's some real problems with her claim here, and I don't see any. I couldn't find anything to back it up. I actually spent a good bit of time trying to look for it, and I didn't find anything.
Well,
I have
lots of
her
claims
claim.
here. Here's other. I mean, what else is she saying? This, if you haven't heard about their latest investigation, key donors to the U.S. Democratic Party are involved in the Ukrainian funeral business, controlled by Zelensky, and making multi-million-dollar profits on the deaths of Ukrainian soldiers and Western mercenaries.
And are you? That's definitely. Are you serious about this kind of a claim?
Okay, all right. I hadn't seen that before. That's new.
I saw that next one, the whole mafia thing. Yeah. I can't quite read it, but I've seen that picture before.
Yeah, this is about Italian illegal
this is
arms
an old,
market.
This is an old, this goes way back. This is an oldie but a goodie kind of a thing, where the old Soviet propaganda used to say that America was so corrupt, and they would point to, what was that untouchable guys? They got him on tax evasion, Al Capone. So they talked about Al Capone and all of our gangster movies, and America's run by gangsters. And so that really takes me back. So that's like Soviet propaganda from like the 50s and 60s.
I don't know what the vampire is about, but because I can't read the language. Biden administration accused of a number of White House whistleblowers of being involved in the sale of tens of thousands of underage children to elite high-level pedophiles.
Bold claim.
Very.
I don't see anything to back that up. That's somebody giving Trump a car. I don't know if that's true or not. I saw that on our TV feed earlier.
I saw it. That's what's his name, Aiden Ross, yesterday. I was like, is this real? Like, what is this about? I don't get it. He gave him a Rolex and a Cybertruck. Why would you do that?
That's because Musk has been starting to back Trump. So, yeah.
It was weird. I've never seen anything like that.
Yeah.
I
agree that it's weird.
I wasn't even thinking, but I'm buying into the whole weird campaign now, right? But that was weird. That was weird. Sorry.
Yes, it was weird. True. And all these claims are, I mean, they're very bold, but I don't see the backup and the flipping the script on it to try and either equivocate or obscure, make people doubt their own side. This is standard Russian tricks. And if there was any backup, I'd say go for it. But I looked, and there's just nothing there. She did make one claim for an Argentinian group. I had it written down somewhere. I caught it. Sorry. I grew up in Denver, Colorado, where there's a lot of Hispanic people. So I don't speak Spanish very well, but at least I can hear it and type it relatively quickly. So I did Google it. That was one of the very few claims that she made that was accurate, where there was an Argentinian group that was pretending to be a refugee help group, and there were some problems. But the part that she did not mention is that Ukraine had sent a delegation down to Argentina to talk to the Ukrainian government saying, we got to work this out. This is a problem. So she's accusing people, but the Ukrainian and the Argentinian governments are trying to fix it. So when there was something, I actually did find it. But that the White Angels are not, there's nothing there. There's no there.
Yeah. Again, it's, it's sort of like, show me the proof.
Yeah. And if you have proof, great. But if you don't, then I'm going to call you what you should be called, is a Russian propagandist. So, not you. Sorry. That was a her. You. Sorry.
Well,
you're just David Duchovny from the X-Files.
I need my tinfoil hat.
Let's not talk about that Weird Al song. That was a great song.
Okay, so what else did you want to talk about?
We can. There was one thing that she said, and I'm trying to find where I wrote it down, It was right at the end of the interview, and I'd like to say it was at minute 118. Maybe I put it in my email.
Well, I can see what the clips are that you have here. Hang on a second. You had, dehumanizing people or something?
Yeah, where she was, because you were not pushing her, you were acknowledging that her point of view, she did not agree with the American and Ukrainian governments, which everybody's got a point of view. So fair enough, if she was an honest actor, she's allowed to disagree with the American and Ukrainian governments. And to be fair, I criticize the American and Ukrainian governments. There's problems that we're not perfect and we need to fix it. Even as a small, just dollar example, there was, in terms of something it came up, we were trying to do the right thing and there was a mistake and now we got to fix it. So, and it was a big thing in American politics for a little while, like, oh, there was a corruption in aid to Ukraine. And anybody that's dealt with American government and especially military finances and asset, how we place a dollar amount value onto an existing asset. So there's a whole bunch of valuation tables where if it's a brand new asset or like inside of 2 years old, it's considered above 90% of its original purchase cost. For the most part, the computer technology devalues faster than that. But if you're talking about like a truck or something like that, it's considered to still be a very, very high value asset, near 100% of its original purchase cost. But if you're talking about something like a Bradley fighting vehicle, the American Army introduced the Bradley in 1981. And I would assume that a lot of the Bradleys that we gave to the Ukrainians were built in the 1980s and 1990s. That's just what I would assume. So you're talking about a tracked vehicle that's at least 20 years old, possibly 40 years old. It's not going to be worth the brand new build cost of $3.2 million, which is what it costs to buy a Humvee, at least according to the quick search I did. And if you're talking about giving Ukraine 100 Humvees at $3.2 million a pop, all of a sudden you're into the billions of dollars real fast. But if you're talking about something that's 40 years old and it's probably not worth its initial purchase price. So that's where these disparities came in, where there were discrepancies of billions of dollars in the aid that the United States had provided to Ukraine. And they were trying to make this into a big political deal. But I'm just reading it going, yeah, somebody just looked at the wrong table. They filled out the spreadsheet of what we had given in like a Bradley fighting vehicle. Maybe they just Googled what a Bradley fighting vehicle was cost, $3.2 million. They listed it that way. I'm not saying it was the Bradleys, but just as an example, they listed the brand new price and they're like, no, this is a really old system. We need to look at the valuation table that marks depreciation over time and accurately. So it was a correction from what we did right away to get the stuff on paper and send it to Ukraine. And then we're looking at it again going, yeah, that wasn't quite right. And we fix the new number reflects what was true all along. We just entered it wrong the first time. Does that make sense? So sure. We do try and correct things as they go along. But she had this thing where I was into this because, I criticize the government, like, you guys got to do it right. But she had this thing where she's like, I don't have a feeling for the Ukrainian and American governments because I only have feelings for humans.
And I'm just run that clip so that.
What did you just say? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, we'll run that and then you can comment.
Totally agree with you. There are always good people and bad people. Like you mentioned twice that I probably don't like Ukrainian government or American government. I've not that. I can't have any feelings to something that has no soul. I experience feelings only to human beings. And but talking in general, you are completely right. There are good people and bad people, and every time we do some work, we are hoping that good people hear that and support it, because how much can we do? All what we can do is just bring awareness to the issues.
Yeah.
So yeah, I had now maybe this is just me going, my hackles raised a little bit because of the dehumanizing rhetoric that she started to say. Now, was that for all of Ukraine? Was it just about a comment on the Ukrainian government's no good? But given how she had been doing the rest of it with all these really bold claims and really problem claims, false claims, I have questions. Now, again, obviously this is not her native language, and sometimes that can cause weird things to come out of people's mouths. So fair enough, if that's not what she meant, I would be more than willing to hear her correct that. But that sort of rhetoric with Ukrainians aren't people is coming out of Russia and coming out of the Kremlin. So I do actually have real questions on whether she meant it or not.
Yeah, I don't know. I personally, I didn't pick up on it at that moment when we were doing the interview.
I didn't pick up it
um,
until the second time that I saw it because it kind of went real fast.
But there is history there within Ukraine with the way you've already talked about it, with the way Ukrainians have been treated in the past by Russia through history.
And that's why my hackles raised a little bit, like, because this is part of the larger narrative. Whether she meant it individually and from her own heart, I don't know. But it is consistent with Russia's narrative the last 10 years, ever since they decided that Donbass was no longer part of Ukraine and it was part of Russia.
Yeah. And I have seen online influencers pro-Russian using dehumanizing language. I have seen it. That's what goes on during wars. If you want to convince a group of people that you've enlisted as soldiers to go out and kill people on the other side, one of the oldest tricks in the book is to dehumanize the enemy and get your people starting to think about those people as not people, as not humans. It makes it a lot easier to kill human beings.
So I want to put a little, I didn't expect to be talking about this tonight. So when you go to a recruiter for the United States military, you are true, because we have a history of that. There were, especially about the Japanese in World War II, there were various racial slurs that happened, and it still goes on, but it's corrected now. Does that make sense? You can actually get in trouble for using them now. Yeah. When you go to a recruiter for the United States military, I had to do this. You take a psychological evaluation test. The reason why they do that is they don't want people in the United States military that are prone to that sort of thinking. You need to do your job. You need to do it professionally. You need to treat people properly. I'm going to go back to that Jim Mattis quote about be courteous, be professional, but have a plan to kill everyone you meet. It's very almost dispassionate. He was talking about you need to come home at the end of the day, and you need to plan for all contingencies. Otherwise, there's going to be problems. But the other side of that is the very real situation where American military recruits are psychologically screened to get the less stable ones out, to screen them from the very start. You can get in trouble, official trouble, for dehumanizing language, racist language. That can be both for your brothers and sisters in the American military. It can be for the enemy. Does it still happen? Yes. But that's because we haven't completely solved the problem yet. So you are right. There is a history of that. But it has been recognized as it's kind of a problem. Because if you do start dehumanizing the enemy, you're not going to treat them properly. You're not going to do your job.
Well,
properly.
I was actually referring to the history of that within Ukraine, with the history of Russia treating Ukrainians And you've alluded to it as sort of second-class citizens.
And I
There is a
did,
history of it.
and sorry, I guess I wasn't clear on what I meant, is that there is a history of that worldwide. And the Americans had problems with that in the past. We're trying to fix it. And the Russians are doing that to the Ukrainians now. Now, there is a little bit, you do have to put yourself in the right headspace to do your job. But like I said, the Ukrainians treat their prisoners properly, as one example. They're doing their job. So when they fight, they're going to be, full force, full violence, maximum effort, as Deadpool might say. But when they need to be, they're going to do their job. So one thing we didn't necessarily touch on, this goes back to criticizing your own government. She did bring up the weapons trafficking, and this is a common thing in the West that Russia has been scoring points on, spreading the disinformation that the weapons that we're sending are winding up in the wrong hands. Now, hers was almost cartoony with going to Italian mafias. It's like that was like straight out of, bargain basement DVD bin somewhere at like a used store where you can buy this gangster movie for $2. So I did research this because she made a relatively specific claim that when you do disrupt a nation with a war, you're going to have problems because obviously the police can't go where the combat is. They can't really do their job. The military police kind of can, but not really even still. So there is a problem. There was a problem before with cartels. And I will note that there was one cartel that kept coming up, the Kimpron cartel, Khimpron, which is a Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian transnational crime organization. That is one of the few that I found. They are supplying drugs to the front line and elsewhere, and I will note they are trying to supply them on both sides. So this is not a Ukrainian problem. This is a war problem. And since it's public notice, I'm sure that there's many nations, police, and investigation and Interpol watching this and looking for people. I did find one example where there had been attempts at stealing guns and munitions, but they have been foiled by Ukrainian intelligence. So they were caught, and Ukraine is watching for it. So is the United States. And we will note that one of the disrupted plots came from an organized crime group headed by a Russian. So it was a Russian organized crime group trying to steal American weapons that was disrupted. So it just, bold claims, half-truths, but the idea that Ukraine is more of this crime-ridden cesspool that Russia is trying to push is not true. Are there problems? Yes, but Ukraine is trying to address them. America is trying to help. Some of our aid goes to fund their police, goes to pay their school teachers, so that they can fight this more effectively, that the Russian invasion isn't going to devastate them into this crime-ridden kind of a thing, that they can actually be a nation of laws. So that was one of her weird things that I had to look up, and I'm like, I'm not sure I believe you. So it was one I wanted to touch on. We kind of did a little out of order, which is great.
Okay.
So,
yeah. I think there was something else you wanted to talk about too, wasn't there?
Let me see if I hit everything in my notes here.
Oh, you something about small things left unpunished or something.
Oh, so yeah, this was an interesting clip where, and this is why when I was watching it for the second time, that I didn't catch the first time, but this is one of the reasons why that dehumanizing language that she had, I'm like, did she actually want to correct this? Because you had asked her a question about how little things can spiral into bad things, into really horrible things. And her humanity showed, which was kind of an interesting part of the interview, if you wanted to play that.
Sure. I think this is it. Heads out all over the world. Isn't this just a tragedy?
Definitely it is.
We're talking about the children again here, by the way,
Yes.
folks. So that's and actually organ harvesting and in that interview we were talking about what was really going on in Africa and how this is a global problem. She was sort of trying to bring it back to Ukrainian children being abducted by Ukrainian military and then sold or something. But anyway, it just spreads out all over the world. Isn't this just a tragedy?
Definitely it is. It is. And, I believe when something small is left unpunished, it will cause more and more crimes, and it will lead to more and more drama that we just saw as an example of yours.
So
yeah.
Out of her mouth are the reasons why we need to support Ukraine. And that's why I thought that was such an interesting part of the interview, that there are things that are going on. Some of them are small, like her false accusations or her really weird Italian mafia things, that they're small, but if you walk past, then you say they're okay. And they get bigger. If we walk past Russia invading Ukraine, what we basically said it was okay. So what would happen if the next time they want to invade a country? Because it's not just Ukraine that they want. They want Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. They want Belarus even harder under their thumb than they currently are. They want Kyrgyzstan. They want Georgia. They want Kazakhstan. They want all of these nations. Putin's basically trying to rebuild the Soviet Union. If we say that the invasion of Ukraine is okay, where does it stop? And if we ignore what they do, how could we even pretend to be a nation that values liberty, values freedom, values the rule of law, values good actors, values things getting better over time, values criticism, values valid criticism, that when people are doing the wrong thing, people like you and I criticize and make it better. If we walk past what Russia is doing, then where does that end? It spirals out of control. It goes other parts of the world. One really weird example, I wasn't sure if I wanted to cover this, but it's an example of Russia's wider attempt at propaganda, is a couple of years ago, and this was all over, I don't know if it hit the Canada conservatives, but it was all over American conservatives, with this female boxer out of Algeria that Russia, a couple of years ago, all of the amateur boxing matches were governed by, I don't know what it stands for, but it's IBA, International Boxing Association, maybe something simple like that. And it's a Russian-run organization, and they had been the governing body for amateur boxing for a long time. And a couple of years ago, this Algerian lady defeated a Russian boxer who had been undefeated. And then after the match, Russia released this test that they never told us what the test was. They never told us what they were testing for. They never told us what the results were, but they said that she was disqualified. And that they did that because it restored their Russian boxer's undefeated record, because she obviously couldn't lose to somebody that was disqualified. So they pushed that again in the Paris Olympics against this same person. This person didn't do anything wrong. She was an athlete that is really good at her sport. And now she's competing for a medal. And they went after this person just for being good at their sport. But what they're doing is part of this fear, uncertainty, doubt, and despair. They throw out this very bold assertion that this person's not qualified. And then the American conservatives in the current environment turn out this thing about, well, maybe she's not really a woman. She is. She always has been. She's actually from a nation where it would be illegal for her to even pretend or say that she might not be a woman. Does that make sense? Where she wouldn't have survived this long. She would have not have been in the Olympics, much less the representative of the nation of Algeria at the Olympics.
So I only took note of that, but this is the boxing match where the one competitor
A main
quit?
Khalif. Yeah.
It quit like after a minute and a half or whatever it was.
Yeah. And I don't know
Yeah.
why she quit, but that was the opponent of the Algerian.
And then the allegation was, or it went viral on social media.
Yeah,
that it was
somebody
a
was saying,
transgender,
Yeah.
a transgender. But you're saying that it wasn't a transgender?
Not
person?
even close. Which is funny because they put her face side by side with Lady Diana, the Ukrainian princess, the British princess, and their facial features are almost identical. And they're trying to say this boxer looks like a dude, and then she looks a lot like Princess Diana, who was one of the icons of female beauty.
And
The
so-
facial features and all that kind of stuff.
And so you're saying that it's a Russian propaganda
Yes,
campaign?
100%. And it's been going for a little while. And there's a reason why this Russian-run body, IBA, has not been any part of the Olympics since 2016, is because they've been playing these kinds of shenanigan games with athletes. And like I said, this they made this claim against this Algerian boxer after she beat the Russian boxer. That was the when this started to come out. But we have no idea what they did. This group was famous for not being public, not being upfront, not being fair. And then, of course, since Russia is not allowed in the Paris Games because of the invasion and the war, that they're not allowed to call an invasion in a war and all of the war crimes, they're not allowed to be in the Olympics. There's a couple of Russians there that can't compete under their flag. The Russian anthem cannot be broadcast if they win anything, but that's it. And so Russia's trying to we're not being in the game, so we're just going to cause chaos. So that's part of their fear, uncertainty, doubt, and despair campaign.
And so your evidence is plain to see because you can point to very specific events, and it's all very public.
She was born a female. She grew up a female. Her passport is a female. She's from a nation where being transgender is illegal. She is put up by her nation as one of the top athletes that we are going to put her on an international stage where she can compete. And it's just it's like this bold claim, like what Mr. Otto is doing, and it's just completely wrong. And there's that one thing from a couple of years ago from the Russian-run body, and they didn't even tell us what it was. But the new body that declares whether athletes can compete in the various sports, it completely cleared her. So it's just there's no there. One of the things that they try and do, they try and get plausible deniability by laundering information through Western sources, and that's what they did with this boxer. What this does is it causes a disinformation storm that harms innocent people or people Russia wants to go after. And this Algerian boxer just was part of this storm, and there's all sorts of nastiness online going on about her. And yeah,
well, they got me.
Yeah, and they got a lot of people.
Yeah, this is the first I did see someone talking about how this Algerian boxer is actually a woman, not a transgender. And I went, oh, that goes against everything that I've been seeing and reading and hearing, even in mainstream media up here in Canada. So,
and who knows how it even started? What was the first? Because it's kind of such a hot button wedge issue in politics today.
Yes.
Where did that first, and how easy was that hook to get in? So when we talk about our sources and how we validate what source is trustworthy and what source is not, one of the things that we have to look at is what is our own bias. So, and I'm going to be honest, when I was looking through Ms. Terada's claims, I looked for a lot of things. I'm like, if this is true, it's kind of a problem. Maybe that's my bias that when these claims happen, they need to be investigated. But just because they're investigated doesn't mean that they're true. So I'm wondering how easy some of these hooks got into some of these people where this is such a wedge issue. Maybe people need to re-examine their own biases. If nothing else, maybe people just need to not believe everything that they see or hear.
Yeah. A few nights ago, we had Joseph Leonard on from Detroit, who sometimes comes on the program talking about the Sevastopol beach attack. You indicated in your email message to me that that's something else you might want to comment on tonight.
Yeah, we can talk about that if you want. Because
Sure.
we ended my last session with it, and I didn't necessarily have a great answer to it because it had just been a couple of days before. I hadn't really looked at it that hard.
Yeah, so Joseph came on the other night and said that basically, from everything he had researched, he wanted to talk about it because he says that the claims of cluster munitions coming from ATACMS missile had been exaggerated, that the original claims that the ATACMS missile that made it through to this beach in Crimea, in Sevastopol, the Sevastopol beach, that it, the original claims coming from the Russian side were that the beach had been intentionally targeted by Ukraine. And then you had about 150 people injured or something like that, and 3 people
That was
killed,
the claim.
whatever it was.
Yes.
Yeah. So here's
Which-
the
Which, yeah, go ahead and play it. I don't think there's any sound. We can talk about it.
Sure.
In the distance, you're going to see what looks to me an awful lot. I guess there is sound. Sorry.
Yeah,
It looks
I
to
take
me
the
an
music off.
awful lot like a circular pattern of a cluster munition armed. And so you see a couple of little spots there, but it doesn't look like a circle pattern close by because you can see some of the spray on the ocean where maybe it was you see that little blurred out part in the middle where, yeah. So here's the thing, though. We don't know if one of them was maybe intercepted. The Russian S-300, S-400 are not very good at intercepting these missiles, so that's another discussion point. So there's that little blurred section where you can't quite tell what's what going on. But here's the thing. Russia is occupying Crimea illegally. Crimea is Ukrainian land by international law, and Russia is the occupying force. I didn't have the exact article queued up, but under Article 57, subsection 2, line C of the Additional Protocol 1 of the Geneva Conventions, the warring parties are required to protect civilians when possible. They're required to give warnings in case of imminent attack that might or might not harm civilians. For the past 10 years, Ukraine has been warning the civilians of Crimea, especially around Sevastopol, because of the airfields and the radar and the naval base and all of the military targets right there. They've been warning the citizens of Crimea and the citizens of Russia. Crimea is a target. The SAM missile sites there, the radar sites there, the naval sites there are legitimate military targets. And we want our land back because Russia is an illegal occupier of our land. We're going to go after it. So they've been warning Crimeans, be careful. They've been warning Russians, don't vacation in Crimea. This is a hot war zone. You might get hurt. We don't want to, but you might because it's a war zone. It's our land and we're trying to take it back. Under that same article, Russia is also supposed to be warning civilians in its occupied territory of the danger. They're supposed to have a warning system in place. So if you're in Kiev or any other part of Ukraine that's not under Russian control, you can get an app on your phone that the Ukrainian government put together. They hooked into the early warning network of radars and the rest that says, hey, there is an air raid incoming. And I should do whatever I feel is necessary for my safe. There's air raid shelters I can go to. The Ukrainian government has been doing an excellent job of following this protocol. And they've been trying to do what they can for the occupied territories as well. Russia has not been doing that. There is no app. There are no, like in America, we have tornado sirens. In the Cold War, they were nuclear sirens as well. If there's any harsh thunderstorm in my area, the tornado siren goes off and I go to my basement, right? Because I live in tornado land. The Russians are not providing that in Crimea. There was no early warning for an incoming attack. Russia did not fill their obligations to protect the civilians in territory that they occupy. So this is, if you want my primary source for international laws of war, I've got two. The International Committee of the Red Cross is what the Geneva Conventions are usually negotiated under. I also have defense.gov, the teaching material I used when I was active duty in the United States Air Force. It's a very long document. I finally read it all the way through again. I hadn't done that in a while. It's all out there. It's really easy to find. And again, it was a bold claim. I sent you a couple of pictures that I had found.
Yeah, this one. We've got this here.
There's radar right close to the beach. There's an airstrip that's right on the beach. There's another one. Well, this is one you can kind of tell. So right in the bottom middle of the picture, you can see where the approach for those landing strips go right down to the beach. And a legitimate target is putting holes in the runway so that the jets can't use it. So there's that radar that I had was this is a close-up of that one base where the airstrips go down. You can see MiG-29, some version of a flanker. If I remember correctly, there's also some right in the top middle. Those are Su-24s, those swing wing aircraft. If you're more familiar with Western jets, they're similar to an F-111 that we retired. So they're attack jets. These are the aircraft that are currently using that landing strip, and that's a very legitimate target. Like I said, Ukraine's been warning the citizens of Crimea for 10 years.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we showed those same and similar photos the other night when Joseph was on. He wanted to talk about this exact same thing, and that's what we did here, because we're always trying to get people closer to the truth. And, one of the narratives that's been spun up from the Russian side for a long time is that, through this conflict, is that Vladimir Putin has been very restrained in his special military operation. And that, what we're hearing from the Russian side is that NATO has no chance. Ukraine is doomed, and it's going to be over in, 72 hours.
Fear, uncertainty, doubt, and despair.
Yeah. And
that's what those lines are.
And yet today, I'm seeing this in Forbes, which would suggest that restraint is actually what's being practiced on the other side, on the NATO side. Ukraine had a chance to blow up Russia's best warplanes on the tarmac. The White House said no. And now it's too late. And that's because of concerns about possible escalation.
So it's not too late, and we are still... Ukraine is attacking them. Some of those are out of reach of the weapons that we've sent so far. It depends on what airstrip you're talking about, whether it would be within ATACMS range or not. But what it's not out of range of are domestically produced and designed Ukrainian drones that they launch at a lot of these airstrips. There was one just the other day where a couple of aircraft got destroyed, but even more so, it's a big, if you're familiar with Russian airplanes, it's a major base for Sukhoi 34, which are their strike fighters, and Sukhoi 35, which are their air superiority fighters. They're both versions of the old Sukhoi 27 flanker. But that's the base. And they hit a couple of the jets, but more importantly, what they hit was the ammunition depot and just completely destroyed it. And they did it with Ukrainian drones. So the White House is talking about restraint. I agree. But the Ukrainians are using their own weapons. So there's finesse points to U.S. law and international law about this. They're complicated. I'm not positive the White House made the right call. Here I am criticizing my own president. Yeah. But I at least understand why they're doing it. there's a lot of Ukrainians that say that we did not give them enough weapons fast enough. That's wrapped up into this, where we should have given them long-range weapons right away. I disagree with that criticism because of there was what was ideal and then there was what was possible, and so we followed a lot of what was possible.
Well, my takeaway from this is just that the narrative that we've been fed for the last couple of years is that Vladimir Putin could go in there, and if he went in with a heavy hand, he could just end this thing immediately. But no, he wants to take a soft touch, and he's being very methodical, and he doesn't really want to, inflict too many, too much collateral damage. Right?
But that's them excusing their military failures.
a lot of restraint. But then when I really stand back in the last few months in particular, and I'm looking at this, and I continue to listen to the pundits on the other side who keep saying, it's no use, we're the NATO's doomed. But then I look at this, and it's like, you know what? Actually, Ukraine has been, sort of handcuffed. Can't strike missile launchers on the Russian side of the border until just recently. Here's a story about how they could have launched an attack to take out some Russian jets, and the White House told them, nope, can't do that. We're too concerned about possible escalation. So it's actually a lot of restraint on the NATO side when you stop and think about it.
Especially if you start thinking about the cyber attack on Estonia, like I'd like to say it was 04 or 08. The attack on Czech soil in 2014 that I mentioned earlier in this podcast, the assassination, the Novichok poisonings in the United Kingdom, the influence operation that affected the Brexit vote, the more recent, just in the last couple of weeks, attempted assassinations on the German Rheinmetall executives, and the list goes on and on and on and on. There is a very significant Russian campaign. If they're saying Russia's showing restraint, well, you weren't watching those first couple of weeks of this invasion. They went in hard, and it's they're trying to excuse their own mistakes, their own incompetence, if they're trying to say that Putin was showing restraint. He blew that dam that caused just astonishing amounts of damage to civilians and civilian infrastructure. He went after that nuclear plant. He went in there with tanks shooting at a nuclear plant. How does that make sense to anyone? That's not even remotely restrained. Why on earth would you shoot an armor-piercing round at a nuclear plant? This is a round that's designed to go through almost 900 millimeters of solid steel. This is not restraint here. So a big armored column that stretched from Belarus to Kiev, that was how many miles long? Russia is not showing restraint, but if they say they are, they're just trying to cover their own incompetence.
So, yeah, I just different perspectives, right? Like, and what I'm seeing is that a lot of what I've been fed over the last couple of years, not maybe as accurate as I thought that it was. So I've really started to question some of the people who keep regurgitating the same narrative over and over and over again, and we're not getting the result that they're predicting over and over again, right? So
sorry, I haven't been looking at the comments much, but somebody said those are the marks of a bully that learned a lesson. And that was kind of an interesting take on Russia trying to say, "Oh, we've been restrained," when really it was they tried to kick Ukraine hard, and Ukraine came right after them, and probably throat punched them a little bit. Sorry, that's a military thing. Throat. I can't remember the acronym again. You go after the vulnerable spots. The throat, groin, stomach, I believe, but I'm unsure of the stomach part of it. So yeah, Ukraine throat punched the Russian army, and now Russia's like, oh yeah, we didn't really mean to be. No, it's just that Ukraine hit them back real hard.
Yeah, well, it's pretty clear to me that how long has it been now?
2.5 years.
2.5 years.
Almost, not quite. We're in the third year.
This was supposed to be over in short order, like right off.
Well,
but no.
We had assumed at the start that Russia had a competent military, and they had been making noises about modernization. They had been making noises about making their command structure and formations competent more along a Western model and less along a Soviet model, where you can, when you have like a platoon of a platoon of a couple of dozen people, you can break that down into coherent, functional squads of even like just 4 people that can think and act independently, and they're trained to they know each other, they can get in each other's head. They're like, this 4-man group knows what this 4-man group's going to do, so they might not even need to talk, and they can be effective and act without even saying a word. They didn't do that. Even down to the basic things like that armored column that tried to attack Kiev from Belarus was miles and miles and miles long, and somehow it got stopped. An armored column, when it gets stopped, at least in Western doctrine, what you do, if you have to stop, you herringbone off. So vehicle 1 goes off to the right at a 45-degree angle. Vehicle 2 goes off to the left, and then you zipper down the column. What that does is it keeps the road clear, and then if there's a damaged vehicle somewhere, the wrecking and repair and crane crew can get to that vehicle. If you need to go through with food, water, ammunition, fuel, the road's clear. They didn't do that. So it's just these people lined up on the road. The supply can't get to them. The wrecking crews can't get to them. They didn't send out. The other thing is when you herringbone off, the infantry is supposed to dismount, and immediately you're supposed to do, at least in the West, you're supposed to do 5 and 25s. You have people go out to 5 meters from the vehicle, another group go out to 25 meters from the vehicle. Basically, you're trying to establish a secure zone around the vehicle. So the infantry is supposed to then protect the armored column that is stopped, because a stopped armored column gave up its mobility and is now vulnerable. So the infantry didn't do that. The Ukrainian Javelin and Stugna and AT-4 and all those LAWs, the British anti-tank round, they were able to get in close and just start picking them off, because they didn't herringbone, so the supply couldn't get there. The infantry didn't do its job screening the vehicles. It was just gross incompetence on the Russian army's part. And it was, to me anyway, I was just watching it, just astonished that an army that was supposed to be one of the best in the world was that incompetent. I'm like, what are they doing? And obviously they weren't doing their job.
Information warfare, one of the main battlefronts here, and I would say I've experienced a little bit of that just within the last week with this this sub that was sunk in Crimea. I think the official Russian line coming out of there is that it didn't happen. That's what the information was that came out, and which made me like approach this with caution. It was like, well, maybe the Ukrainian claim of sinking this sub, the Rostov-on-Don, not true. I'll wait and we'll try and get some proof. So I have, since then come up with some visual evidence to prove that the sub is indeed at the bottom of the ocean, well, in port.
It was promoted a coral reef, as the Ukrainians like to say. A nation with no navy has managed to sink at least a third of the Russian Black Sea Fleet.
So I think you wanted to comment on this as well. So
there's another picture out there. What happened is there was the submarine. Was it the Rostov-on-Don? Was that the name of the sub?
Yeah.
Russian subs are weird. They have a number until like they do something special, and then it's like this weird thing where Russia gives it a name. So completely tangential trivia about the Russian Navy. But this submarine was in dry dock because you need to do that, and the Sevastopol base is a major base. So every once in a while, Navy ships, including submarines, need to go in dry dock. So it was doing whatever it needed to do in dry dock, and the Ukrainians hit it with some sort of missile. Maybe it was a Storm Shadow, I don't know. Some sort of cruise missile hit it and just pulverized it. And it basically installed screen doors on a submarine, which is never very good. And so they didn't know what to do with it. It's an expensive submarine. It's a relatively new build, hopefully one of the more capable ones. So obviously they wanted to fix it if they could. They moved it further into the Sevastopol harbor. It's like a long river thing with things shooting off. And they moved it farther upstream and then into one of those side bits, and they had built a repair facility with a roof over it, and trying to hide it. There's another picture out there that shows the stern end of the sub, the X tailplane. It was there. It got hit, and it's no longer there. Like I said, it got promoted to coral reef.
Yeah, so again, I'll show you this photo. I showed it the other night when I got a hold of this. On
And
the
in
right
the other
side,
picture, that right side where there's that hole in the roof, that's where you could see the tailplanes of the sub sticking out. And that's what I'm saying. Ukraine kindly added screen doors to that submarine.
yeah, and this is actually an old photo.
That
Two
was
old
the
photos
initial
from
attack, what was it,
Yeah.
a year ago?
a year ago. There actually, I think, as I understand it, there have been 3 attacks on this sub. So it's like a multiple sunk
Well,
sub.
So
But,
this is one of the cruise missile launchers, and the surface ships are very vulnerable, as we've been finding out. But the submarines, because once they leave harbor, they submerge, and Ukraine doesn't have a great way to detect submerged subs. So the submarines are a very large cruise missile threat still. So yeah, they're going to go after it. They're going to go hard.
Yeah, and so here you can see that green area. That's the sub sitting at the bottom on the right-hand photo, and on the left, in the red circled area, there's a crane that has been moved in to lift
Oh yeah,
that sub.
it's a barge crane. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah, yeah. So that's what's going on there, and so yeah, it's a real thing. It actually happened, but I think there is a rule or a law in place where you're not allowed to show damage in Russia.
Yes.
If something's,
Because that's considered a crime, something about maligning the armed forces. I forgot what their actual terminology was.
Right.
Bringing discredit on the armed forces, or it's basically treason for speaking the truth.
which is why we're not getting that kind of information forthcoming from the Russian side, right?
Those leaks of those gigantic holes in the submarine actually came from Russian. It was, I like to say, it was a Russian Telegram channel that those leaked on, because the Russians are like, hey, look what's going on here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's part of the information war, right?
Yep.
So but
I would
here,
say-
I'll run it. Like, it's like, I'll tell you the truth if I can get a hold of it.
So back to the Russian playground of playbook of fear, uncertainty, doubt, and despair. One of the only ways of confronting that is with truth. You have to ask questions. You have to dig. You have to look for valid sources. That's the only way. And then admit when you're wrong. If you are wrong, admit it. Those are the only ways to confront it. Because sometimes you get dragged in. I have never claimed that everything I believe was true, but when I find out it's not true, I work hard to fix it.
Yeah. Well, me too, and you have to do that. Now, I will say as well that, well, before I get into that, are there any other subjects or anything else you wanted to touch on tonight, Mike?
No, I think I've hit pretty much everything I wanted to do.
Yeah.
I really wanted to hit their propaganda techniques. When people understand that when things are coming out and they're trying to evoke fear, they're trying to evoke uncertainty, they're trying to instill doubt, they're trying to build people into a state of despair. That's the Russian goal on these sort of propaganda campaigns. And they do it sideways. They come at you from directions that you don't necessarily expect. So I want to make sure that people understand that that's what Russia is doing. Russia's a poor country, but that doesn't actually take a lot of money. And one of the parts of being in a free Western country, it's both a feature and a curse, where they are able to get their hooks into the Western social media and the legit media. A journalist that maybe isn't careful might be laundering it for them, whether intentionally or not. Or maybe they just want to present it like saying, hey, this is what the Russians are trying to say, but it works its way into the system. And people need to be they need to use their brains.
And look at what happened with the Sevastopol Beach narrative. It made its way all the way to here. I'll show you. RFK Jr., U.S. presidential candidate, right?
And lover
So-
of bear carcasses, evidently.
Yeah, that's another weird thing.
Weird.
Very weird. I'm sorry to keep parroting the the Kamala Harris campaign word, but it's
Shoe
weird.
fits.
It's freaking weird.
Yeah.
But here's, oops, that's not it. I have to bring it up. Okay, so the Sevastopol Beach thing, within a day, it was picked, like we talked about it here on this program, it was picked up by one or two mainstream media outlets, and then they all started to run it. Then the next thing, RFK Jr. is commenting on it, U.S. presidential candidate, saying that it's an act of terrorism. So he's accusing the United States of an act of terrorism because he's buying into the idea that the United States is responsible, and he says so in quotes here on RT, in this RT article, that it's the United States' fault because the United States supplied the ATACMS missiles, and that they've also got weapon systems in Ukraine that only U.S. personnel have the expertise to run.
And that's not true. That's also a
it's not
dig on
true.
Ukraine.
Yeah,
It's
it's
like
not-
insulting to Ukrainians.
It's absolutely not true. I know it's not true. And so I'm like, whose side is this guy on? He's either just completely brainwashed by what he just read in the media without really understanding what he's talking about, or he's working for Putin. I don't know which it is, but that really worries me. That shows how a narrative, well, there's some truth. Something happened there on the beach. It's just not the way that it was originally portrayed. It wasn't a cluster munitions attack intentionally launched against the people on the beach to kill civilians. That's not what happened. But there's RFK Jr. saying that that's what happened, accusing his own country of terrorism, and that's
It's an example of
terrible.
the dangers of a half-truth.
Right. Unbelievable for it to reach
was it?
that level.
Who was it that said that the worst kind of a lie is a half-truth? I can't remember who said that, but I agree with it.
Yeah, just wickedly powerful stuff for it to get to that level so quickly and gain that level of legitimacy. When he says that, a lot of people listen and believe that, but it's not true. The United States, Ukraine, in this case, not guilty of a war crime, not guilty of terrorism.
So maybe the summary of this podcast should be if Russia says it, it's possibly and likely not true.
It
Now,
could
they do
be.
say true things occasionally. A
Yeah.
broken clock's right twice a day. But, or like I said, I watch it to see what they're saying. And, if there's a half-truth in there, we can maybe glean from it. There was a whole part of Western intelligence during the Cold War that they watched all the Russian propaganda outlets to see what they gave away without realizing they were giving it away. So,
Yeah. And not to say that something didn't happen on that beach.
Yes,
It's just
but
that
it
those
wasn't-
initial reports were not really accurate, not true, and then this happens. And and with respect to Mira, very likable. That was the first time I'd spoken with her. I have to say that I got the feeling that her heart was in the right place, but she's working over there in whatever restrictions or with, she's working under. I understand. She's doing what she's doing. She's welcome to come back on the program. Maybe I'll get the both of you on and you can hash it out. I don't know if that would be allowed. But I'll tell you this, this gives me at least some hope. And I'm maybe speaking out of school here a little bit, but after we stopped recording, you know what she said to me? She said, "Do you think that there's going to be a nuclear war?" And I said, "I don't know, but I sure hope not." And she's worried about it too. We're both worried about that. We both don't want that.
Nobody
And
wants that. Well, I
nobody
hope
wants
nobody
that.
wants that.
Right. So regardless of what she might be saying that's true or not true or whatever, she doesn't want a nuclear war. I don't want a nuclear war. You don't. Nobody wants that. And so I'm hoping that, I didn't want this to, I knew that you wanted to come on and talk, and that's great. I don't want this to be perceived as some big hit job on her. Maybe we can just open the narrative more, or the conversation more.
And if she is genuinely worried about the safety of children, that was certainly something she and I can agree on.
There you go. Right. So maybe we can find some common ground somehow, some way. And maybe this in a very, very small way might be a first step toward peace.
Yep. You can always hope. And you never go, you do negotiate with your allies, but you never negotiating peace is not something you do with your allies. It's something you do with your enemies. So people are like, is there going to be a negotiated settlement? That's the only way you make peace. You have to negotiate with your enemies. Now, what terms that are, So.
Yeah. Well, you could have peace if you just quit, if you just give up, surrender, right? But that's not really, I wouldn't say that's really an option.
I can tell you Ukraine does not want Russian lands.
Yeah.
They just don't. They just want their own land back.
I totally get that. Again, the narrative, though, has left people with this sort of twisted mindset that somehow people think that it's Ukraine's own fault or that NATO has done this. But, it's not Ukrainian tanks in Russia. It's Russian tanks in Ukraine.
Yes.
We got to get that in our heads. I do understand that. Now, that being said, I would,
So I laid out a little bit of Ukraine's history and their problems with Russia over the last 100 years or so. You got to realize that the same is true for Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, Poland, Finland. Finland fought some nasty wars against Russia. That Russia invaded Finland. There's a lot of reasons why these nations want to turn to the West, and they simply don't trust Russia. Russia had a choice. They could have been supportive or friendly. They could have been good neighbors. They could have been working with these nations. They chose not to. They chose to send in tanks and airplanes and death and destruction. And there's one person, one nation that's responsible for this war, and it's not Ukraine. As you can say, war came to us.
Yeah, I think the U.S. has made a few mistakes along the way, some big ones. NATO's made some mistakes, but we are where we are right now, and we have to deal with the situation as it is today. And I totally get what the situation is. I'm extremely grateful to you, Mike, for coming on and having this discussion to broaden people's view on this so that we can understand better.
Yep. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. And folks, I will be back tomorrow night, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thank you to all of you, too, for hanging in there tonight and keeping your minds open and entertaining all of these different perspectives. We'll try to get you closer to the truth again tomorrow night, right here on the Maverick News Channel, 7 p.m. Eastern. Catch you all on the flip side.
This has been a Maverick Multimedia production.